Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. The presentation will begin shortly. Hello, and welcome to Get GDPR-Ready Data Repositories with Governed ETL Solutions. When you join today's webinar, you select to join either by phone call or your computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change that selection, you can do so by accessing the audio pane in the control panel to your right. Also, from this control panel, you'll be able to have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing those questions into the questions pane. We'll collect those and address them during a Q&A session later in the call. If we're not able to address your question, we plan on responding to each of those personally through email. The deck for today will be available through SlideShare, along with a recording of the webinar 2 to 3 days after the conclusion of the presentation. So please keep an eye out for that email. My name is Ryan Peterson. I'm the Global Technology Segment Lead for Data at Amazon Web Services. I'll be your host and moderator for today's call. Joined by me today is Christian Raming, the founder and CEO of Atleat, and Ming Wu, the Vice President of Data and Analytics for Okta. Our plan is to cover the adoption of data governance strategies that meet today's data privacy requirements, especially related to GDPR, how de-identification from source data around multiple platforms has become a critical next step, and how we can use Atleat to create and manage highly secured and scalable data pipelines. I'll get started with AWS and the way we think about governance. So at a high level, if you're not using AWS today, our customers tell us that these are the 5 major functions and reasons why they choose AWS. The first is around agility. This idea is that you can spin up a computer system, you can put a piece of software on, you can get that launched, and you can do it really rapidly. Being able to scale that within AWS is also really critical, and so our elasticity, especially around automated elasticity, is one of the other major reasons people choose us. But once you get started in a single geography and your company starts to grow and starts to do more outside of the geography, you want to be able to replicate and copy that exact type of system in different regional locations. And so our global presence is another reason why customers like to use us. Cost, of course, is one of the major functions. When you buy a lot of computer infrastructure and throw it into your data center or into a closet somewhere, that can get very expensive, as well as it usually isn't planned exactly what is needed for the growth that you're looking to achieve. And so we can keep the exact amount of compute that you need and then scale that down or up depending on exactly what you're requiring for that particular moment. And finally, then functionality. We're consistently adding new capabilities and frankly, bringing on great new partners to help with various requirements that companies need. But this is really the reason I wanted to talk today, is that we feel like this front page of the news, there's constantly, it seems like, another set of records being breached, stolen, removed from the environment in some way. And so if you look at 1,700 incidents in 2017, 72% of those came from malicious outsiders. That's traditionally what people think about when they're trying to secure their environment, the perimeter security. What do they have as far as an IDF or IDS? What are they doing from firewall perspective? But they don't tend to think a lot about the data and who actually has access to it. And realistically, blocking people from the outside might be the easier of the multiple problems, but when you get the insider threat, malicious insiders and accidental loss, making up about 27% of the incidents, that's really the harder one to have to deal with. And we got to thinking about this problem and deciding whether or not this was an actual big issue or a smaller issue. And unfortunately, we determined that it was a bigger issue. Just by the end of today's call, for example, we'll see over 300,000 records breached. And that just seems to be a big challenge that needs to be solved. And we're we're intending to help our customers solve that. So we talked to customers. Customers gave us these kinds of questions that they didn't know about their data. So we talked to C-level executives and say, hey, what type of data am I collecting? Where am I storing it? Do I have the right kind of legal agreements and statements? Do I know when I'm deleting it? When I should be deleting it, have to delete it? When I can keep it or should keep it? Who am I giving it to? Where's the data being proliferated? And all these different questions came up as I started asking C-level executives about their data. And regulators were also asking the same questions and have been for many years. You can see a lot of names on here, a lot of brands on regulations like PCI that have been around for many years and deal with privacy in some manner. But the one that really broke open the entire conversation is GDPR. And GDPR is really focused in on this privacy question. So a lot of people think about GDPR Article 17, the right to be forgotten, the right to deletion clause. Some people don't think about the other aspects of that, like Article 18, which is really about access to data and who has access for what permitted use and what use cases. But the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, has taken on almost an exact copy of GDPR, and to some extent has even made it more complicated. And that's really around California residencies. So those are just two. We haven't added to this list the Brazilian rules, the Canadian rules, the Australian rules, or the Thai laws that have changed, or the Indian laws that have changed. So as we get to different laws in different countries throughout the globe, managing this in a pipelined kind of way is going to become quite critical. And so, so we started thinking about what's the root cause of all of the evil. Then is it perimeter security? Do we need better firewall systems? Do we need to provide better answers to customers? And we really realized at the end of the day that PII is the root of all evil. And if you can figure out how to effectively manage PII, then you can deal with that. PII meaning personally identifiable information. So risk comes in any organization by simply collecting PII in the first place. Now, when you start to store that PII, you add a little bit of risk to that, and it's pretty commonly connected, though. You collect it and you store it. When you start to use it, that means that more and more people have access to it, and so you increase your risk a little bit more. Now, where we see the explosion of risk is really around that proliferation. When data leaves your original source system, where you collected it to do something with it, and you start to proliferate it, whether that's to a data lake, to an EDW, you have multiple different BI entities that can start accessing it. Now, potentially, you went from half a dozen or a dozen people that have access to this PI to potentially thousands that can use it at mass scale. And so proliferation is really the question that we wanted to try to answer first. And then, of course, deletion. Deletion is really around the rules and making sure that you have good reporting of how you're doing deletion. So as I started thinking about the design considerations, there's all the obvious design considerations that you would expect in managing TII. But what we discovered is that, well, ETL is better than ELT in this case, because with PII, if you load it into your storage infrastructure, then that means another person has access to it. Even if you end up transforming the data after it lands, that means that some additional people in that storage entity can get access to it. So we said, well, if you can transform the data before it even lands in your lake or in your DW, that's the ideal scenario. We worry about the proliferation, not the collection. And the reason why that, of course, means that you can't get somebody's address, you can't ship them a product, then you have a problem. So you have to collect. But you can reduce your risk by reducing the number of people who have access to that PII. Hashing beats encryption. Now, obviously, different use cases may require encryption. It may require different elements, but we found that if you hash data, it's a one-way process. It means that it can't be used again, but it is useful in the sense that it's a unique identifier. It's unique in the sense that it doesn't identify, but it's a unique that you can figure out that a particular person had these particular artifacts. And then finally, the decentralized matching, when you get to matching content, is better than centralized because it reduces honeypots of risk. So how do you make it so that you can decentralize your use cases? So that led us to building an architecture. Now, this architecture has a lot of little dots on it. I'm not expecting that every customer is going to use every piece of it. What we realized is that as people brought me a use case and said, well, how do I handle this kind of situation? How do I handle that kind of situation? It sometimes meant adding a new capability and showing how that piece might be utilized. And a good example of that might be video and images. Healthcare organizations do MRIs. If a doctor, writes the name of the person on the MRI, or there's an embedded bit of detail. How do you find out what that word is, what that name is, and make sure that that's being de-identified as well and captured? And so, for example, we included recognition that can look at images and seek to find that information. In other cases, the data lake is used to process information. So you might see EMR put in there. You might see some curation steps with Redshift, etc. And so this is pretty much a traditional data lake, but we just added in some additional partner steps. We needed to find various partners who did various things. You'll see like Data Republic's really involved in second-party matching. Data Guys is really about PII masking, filtering. Zaloni is really around data catalog and integrate with AWS Glue. What we're looking for then is an ETL provider that made it so you can pipeline all of this in a governed way. And we sat down with Atleat and realized that they were working on an ETL system that integrated with all these partners. And so that was really a fantastic way for us to install and make it so that you can pipeline all of your governance into your solution. So with that in mind, I really want to focus our attention on Atleat today and give Christian the ball and have him kind of go over what Atleat's doing in the space. Christian?
Thank you, Ryan. My name is Christian Romming. I am the founder and CEO of Atleat, and I'm here to tell you just a little bit about Atleat, the problem we're solving, and how our software can help you save time and engineering resources when you're building out your data lakes and warehouses on AWS. Traditionally, companies have deployed both applications and data warehouses on premises, and their ETL infrastructure has been on premises as well. And today, companies use tens or hundreds of cloud applications in addition to their on-premises applications. And at the same time, AWS data and analytics services have made it easier to build highly performant data lakes and warehouses in the cloud. So you'd think that analytics would automatically get better as a result of these advancements, but what ends up happening in practice is often quite different. At my previous company, we had data in S3, relational databases, various cloud services, and there was a lot of value in this data. And our team of analysts and scientists wanted access to it all. But building our data warehouse ended up being very expensive because as CTO, I had to dedicate multiple engineers to it. And in spite of our best efforts, the data warehouse turned into a maintenance headache. And neither the analytics team nor the dev team were particularly happy about that. And governance was a big challenge as well because there was a large number of disparate data sets, and we'd set up a bunch of transformation rules. And so to try and address these challenges, we evaluated a bunch of different ETL tools, but couldn't find one that was well suited for AWS and that would decrease our overall effort. So the good news here is that if you're able to avoid the galloping engineering costs and keep your data governed, you can reap massive benefits from faster access to more data. And we designed Etleap to help you do just that. Etleap is a cloud-native software as a service ETL solution for building lakes and warehouses. It integrates out of the box with web services, databases, file stores, and also it integrates tightly with AWS services like S3, Glue, Athena, and Redshift. Our web UI lets developers and analysts set up connections and data pipelines in minutes, and our data Wrangler and modeling tools make it possible to define transformations and dependencies without doing any scripting or coding. Monitoring of the pipelines and connections is automatic, and operational support is included with the service. And the end result of this is that setting up ETL processes takes hours instead of months. And as Atleat is delivered as a managed service, there is no infrastructure to maintain. One of the tools that Atleat provides is an interactive data wrangler. Here's a screenshot of it. You can see there's a sample of contact data that's being extracted from Salesforce. And exploring the sample makes it possible to discover what data is available. And over here on the right, I'm defining a transformation script to turn that raw data into structured data to be ingested into my data lake, and also to ensure that PII is dealt with appropriately. See here, I have a blacklist that basically lists certain fields that contain personal information, and so these will basically never be extracted from Salesforce in the first place. Here, I'm telling Atleat to mask these email addresses so that they retain their length and structure, but not their content. Atleat is deployed as a managed service, as I said earlier, and it has two distinct deployment options. With the hosted option, which is illustrated on the left here, data flows through Atleat's multi-tenant infrastructure into your data lake or warehouse. With the VPC option, illustrated on the right, Atleat is deployed on instances within your AWS account, and data does not leave your AWS account as a result. To summarize, Atleat lets you build data lakes and warehouses on AWS in a fraction of the typical time and engineering costs. We build all the integrations to data sources, partners, and AWS services so that you don't have to. And it's architected for governance to let you meet security requirements and compliance with regulations like GDPR and HIPAA. Don't take my word for it. Instead, I'll turn it over to Ming Wu, who will tell you about how Okta built their governed data lake and warehouse.
Great. Thank you, Christian. And thank you for having me. My name is Ming Wu, and I am the Vice President of Data and Analytics here at Okta, and I'm responsible for analytics across the enterprise. Today, we're going to talk about our data de-identification journey for analytics. Before I start, I wanted to provide a little bit of background about Okta. Our vision and mission is to enable any organization to use any technology today and in the future. We do this by securely connecting an organization's people to the set of tools and applications that they use, and we do this for organizations with employees, contractors, partners, or suppliers, and to companies that are connecting consumers and end users to the services that they provide. Okta has been providing identity as a service for nearly 10 years. We pioneered identity management in the cloud, and today we have over 5,100 customers and have over 5,500 pre-built integrations that our customers can leverage, along with the custom integrations that can be built using our platform. Identity is at the core of what we do, so ensuring that we secure our customers in every way possible is a core tenet of how we operate. So let's start off by talking about how data normally flows in an organization when it comes to reporting and analytics. First of all, data has to be extracted from source systems. This may involve extracting data directly from databases that you have on-premise or hosted in the cloud, or it may involve extracting data via APIs from internal or cloud applications such as Salesforce, Marketo, ServiceNow, Zendesk, and so on and so forth. After the data has been extracted, organizations will typically store that data in some form of data lake or storage repo. The expensive part of getting the data out has been done, so keeping it in flat file format is easy and relatively inexpensive. Plus, you can keep that data around indefinitely for use later. From that lake, you've got a set of copy commands that will put that data into either a set of staging tables or directly into your final destination. If you've staged your data, you're likely going to run some type of transformation here on the raw data that will put it into a more consumable or aggregated format that can be easily leveraged. And finally, once the data has been transformed and loaded into the destination table, you can now consume that data for reporting and analysis and are probably using some type of analytics tool and may also be extracting data into Excel files or CSV exports that get passed around within the organization. This is pretty standard. Now, the challenge here is that if you have PII or sensitive data in your source system, it's almost certain that that data is being handled and stored in every single one of the downstream systems. So this means that names, addresses, telephone numbers, email addresses, IP addresses, etc., are likely in S3. They're in Redshift and also sitting in those report or Excel files, and probably for very good reasons. But because that data is being stored in each of those systems, you are required to govern and manage the data to comply with GDPR and other regulations and have to surgically purge the data upon request in order to comply with things like a right to be forgotten request. In addition, if you use any third parties to handle data, they too may also be storing that PII information. So they also have to be now considered in scope as part of the custodian chain. All of this presents a pretty massive challenge. You have to govern and manage your data and carefully control who has access to it. But also, if data has to be deleted upon request of a user or customer, you also have to deal with that in all of your downstream analytics. Basically, if you delete data that you previously reported out, now that that data is gone, if you ever go and rebuild that report again, your numbers are changing, your insights are changing. So you have to think about how do you keep that data without exposing PII. So when it comes to sourcing sensitive data, we think about it from three perspectives. One, what data do I even need? How do you determine the data that you do need versus the data that you don't necessarily need? In almost every case, people assume that more data is better. But with the new regulations, this approach leads to a lot more overhead in management. So you really need to ask yourself about what you need, why, and whether the data should live in your analytics pipeline. And we'll talk about this more in a few minutes. Two, we talked earlier about the likelihood of sensitive data already living in your environment. So once you've identified the data that you don't want, you have to think about how you will start to surgically remove the data from the warehouse and files. This is where things like retention policies and auto-deletion after a period of time can start to help you manage this. And third, finally, is there a way for you to avoid the problem entirely? If you have personal sensitive information stored, you need to be extremely careful with who can access that information and how to ensure that the data is protected. If you can avoid having to store sensitive information entirely, you can create an environment where the focus is more about the analytics and insight that you can gain from the information without having to worry about whether somebody can walk off with that information or if your analytic systems can be hacked to steal that information. So how do we get to that state where we minimize the risk associated with having personal and sensitive information in our analytics pipeline? Well, we think of it as a three-step process: identify, classify, and implement. In the identify stage, we're really talking about how to identify where PII exists, starting with the source system, and then mapping that to every downstream system. Earlier, we talked about how the data flows, and during the identify stage, you're looking at each field of PII to see if it or some version of it exists in each of the downstream systems. This is also where you need to examine your vendor solutions to see if they may also be storing any of the PII data that may be working with on your behalf. Once you've identified where all the data lives, the next step is to classify that information. This is really about putting each type of data into a bucket. First, do you need the data or not need it? If you do need the data, determine what you need and why. You want to ask yourself whether you actually need the raw data or if you can deal with partial data, or if you can work with unique de-identified values such as hashes or even GUIDs, globally unique ID values. For instance, if you're working with phone numbers, is the area code sufficient? Do you need to know the actual phone number, or could you just convert all numbers to a hash and perhaps store the hash along with the area code or other information? Email address is another really common challenge. Can you uniquely hash the email address or use an ID value that can later be used to access the original email address? A pretty common use case for analytics is to generate lists of users for marketing or other purposes, for campaigns. The analytics can actually be performed without the email address itself, but the call to action may require you to do something like a rehydration to get the actual email address later on. You can preserve uniqueness without exposing the raw information and can run all types of analytics and get insight without actually having the raw information. And rehydration allows you to take those unique hashes or ID values from your analytics system and then look them up, whether it's back in the source system or somewhere else, to get the original values. Once the data has been identified and classified, it's time to move on to the implementation. This is where the hard work begins. One of the first decisions that you have to make is to agree on a whitelist or a blacklist approach. And for each of the PII fields that you identified and want to maintain, you need to implement the appropriate solution to handle the classification. Keep in mind that you need to be able to apply that classification methodology across each and every one of your data sources. So you have to think about how you implement the solution for flat file uploads, data from SQL Server, Oracle, or MySQL, API calls from Salesforce or Marketo, etc. And you have to determine the effort and trade-offs required to create a single common solution, which could take longer, or perhaps accelerate your time by implementing multiple point solutions. This is an ideal time to evaluate the build versus buy options. Could a vendor solution help you with some or all of this potentially? So if we come back to our original data flow slide, there's a better approach to dealing with sensitive data. And that's to introduce a transformation process to deal with sensitive data as you extract the information. Essentially, as we sort of highlighted earlier in the webinar, this is putting the T back into ETL. When you combine the extraction and transformation at the beginning, you essentially front-load the work of dealing with sensitive data and avoid the problems and overhead further downstream. At the extraction stage, you have the option of choosing to whitelist or blacklist fields. If you whitelist, you know explicitly what you're going to bring over. If you blacklist, you know upfront what fields you're going to be avoiding, but do need to keep an eye on the sources as more fields are added. And for each field that you do bring over, you can now apply your classification methodology to desensitize that information. You may hash the data, or you may strip the data down to just the country or first few digits of the zip code. And when you've done that up front, the only information that could ever flow downstream is that de-identified data. So you've now removed the PI portion of the equation. So now the data that is stored in the data lake is void of PI. The staging table and destination tables are also free of that overhead. And your reports are still able to provide the analytical insight, but also protect you from exposing PI data intentionally or unintentionally. And keep in mind, the transformation that you do up front can still be supplemented with whatever transformations that you already have between your staging and destination table. So now, you've just created a de-identified data pipeline. At Okta, we enlisted Atleat to help deal with de-identifying many of our analytic data sources, such as Salesforce and Marketo. Atleat, for us, handles the extract and transformation for us out of those systems. We use the data Wrangler to review, understand, and select the data of interest. Atleat also provides that toolkit and methods to cleanse and manipulate the information, and then they handle the downstream processes for us, such as storing the data into S3 and loading it into Redshift for analysis. So they handle the end-to-end process for us and provide our analysts with the required capabilities to self-serve without requiring our data engineers to be involved. Now, in addition to Atleat, we actually also maintain a set of internal pipelines with our own internal data engineering team for data that has to stay protected within our VPC and meet even stricter requirements. So we've actually gone through the end-to-end experience of building this ourselves too. So after having lived this journey with Atleat and on our own, we can look back on it and talk about some of the outcomes and benefits of having gone through it. First of all, one of the biggest things that you get out of this journey is having trust and confidence in your data pipeline. While it's not always glamorous, having a detailed catalog of all of your source systems and locations where sensitive data resides is paramount. You have to start from somewhere. Because you've mapped out the source systems and downstream systems, you can quickly determine how a field is used or if something new has been introduced that you may need to start handling. And this gives you peace of mind. It means that you don't need to go on a hunting expedition to see if you have PI in your data pipelines. You've already mapped everything out. The second thing that we got out of this is an operationalized process. Not only do we know where the data is, we know the right set of questions to ask and how to assess and handle the data. The methodologies aren't being crafted on a one-off basis. They're built into our scoping and review process. Tools like the data Wrangler in Atleat give the analysts ability to do a detailed assessment of the data to see how to transform it and then validate that transformation before the data moves downstream. Another major benefit that we got by approaching this from a buy perspective is time to value. Using Atleat, we are able to build pipelines in just a few minutes, not months. We could bring sample data into the Wrangler, review it, apply the transformation, and then start feeding the data directly into the warehouse. And we can apply this capability to any other sources and data pipelines in the future that are integrated using Atleat. The equivalent process of building these capabilities ourselves for our internal data pipelines was on the order of months. It involved developing the methodology for each source and field, and we had to go through the end-to-end dev, test, release cycle for each method. Plus, we had to apply those same methodologies to all of our back data. So we actually had to support two different implementations, one to handle all the new incoming data, and another to clean up what was already there. Now that we have these capabilities built, you might have asked, well, why don't we just bring it all in-house? It's a fair question. So we could extend these capabilities to support other data sources, but then we would be expending our engineering resources to build out integrations with an ever-growing list of SaaS applications and APIs. And it's just not a core competency or key differentiator that we would want to invest significantly into. Besides, one of the other major benefits of partnering with Atleat was how our team was empowered. We actually got two benefits out of this. First, our analysts are now much more self-sufficient. They can build and manage many of their pipelines end-to-end. And second, because they are self-sufficient, it frees up our engineers to work on higher value initiatives. So with that, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our experience and thoughts. And now I'll turn it over to the Q&A.
Thanks, Ming. That was really great information. Same with you, Christian. I want to remind everybody that we're going to transition to Q&A. So if you have questions for any of the presenters, feel free to ask them in the questions pane. And I'll go ahead and get started with the first one I see here. This is for Ming. Ming, when did Okta start using Atleat? How long has that been in production?
So we started using Atleat back in, I want to say 2016. Christian, you can probably keep me honest on that one. And initially when we started using it, it was really just to accelerate the speed at which we could build pipelines. And when GDPR came around, we really engaged with them to understand their approach and their methodology and saw a significant opportunity to continue to partner and work with them.
Perfect. How did you manage the end user aspect of things? So, end users are used to having all of this personal information, and when you start de-identifying that data, you're now pulling that information out of reports. Did they get frustrated? Did you have to convince them that they didn't need that PII?
That's a really good question. It was a really hard journey, and we had to learn a few things through iteration. When you talk about taking something away from business users, I'm better off going to the dentist, right, to get a tooth pulled. But as a security company, we had one of the benefits there, right? GDPR was coming, so it was very easy to start to explain, look, we have to start to do this to do more to protect customer information, and that is to ensure that, one, we're not exposing it, two, that it can't be taken. A lot of what we had to explain was, while we may be removing the information from reports, we're not necessarily taking the data away or the capabilities, right? All of the data that our consumers would have still resided in, say, Salesforce or Marketo. So what we were saying was, let's decouple the analytics from the raw data. So we can still tell you how many people from Yahoo or Gmail came to our site and did something with us. We just wouldn't tell you that it was ming.wu@gmail.com. So once we explained to them that they would still get the insight and capabilities and that there would just be a few extra steps to go and rehydrate that information, it helped make the process go a little bit more smoothly. But definitely engage with your business partners early, right? Explain to them what is happening, that it's not a unilateral decision that you're making. Give them the basis of the regulations, the what ifs. If we don't remove this data, what could happen? And is that something that we want to really take the risk on? I think the other piece that was really important was the right to be forgotten aspect. People are like, well, we won't worry about that because these campaigns aren't in Europe. That's not true, because a European resident or a resident of the EU can be anywhere, and they can then exercise their rights as an EU citizen to have that data deleted. So once we started to show them how those regulations apply to pretty much everything that we did, and that we might have to start deleting the data if we have PII, and the downstream impacts of what that would do to the reports that they were looking at, then they really started to embrace the change.
Yeah, I think you and I had this conversation a while back, and I really appreciated this concept. We were discussing this idea. Well, what if a French citizen is living in California, and now you have to deal with, well, when they call in, are you having to identify what the residency is or where they're from in order to determine what you should do with their data or a right to be forgotten request? And you had an interesting solution or thought around having to keep kind of everyone the same. You want to maybe discuss that a bit?
Yeah, I think, GDPR and what they're doing for the EU plus CCPA now, these are just tips of the spear. People are waking up with all the recent security breaches and saying, who has my data? What can they do? So I believe that, there's a basic right to be able to have your data deleted, regardless of whether you are an EU citizen today or not, or governed by CCPA. Like, if somebody comes and says, hey, I'm not sure what you're doing with my data, or I don't know how you got it, I'd like you to delete it, I think we have a civic responsibility to support the request. So, if you take that to heart, you now make it part of your core DNA. And that means that you treat everybody with strictest guideline.
Yeah, somebody calls and says, I'm a French citizen. Are you going to say, well, send me your passport to prove it? It seems like maybe that's a bad idea. So I think you're absolutely right there.
And then you have a photocopy of their passport, which is more PII.
Exactly, more information to have to deal with. Well, let me get into another question here. So Gaia asked the question, does Atleat also handle real-time data, or are you really only processing batch workloads?
Yeah, this is Christian here. We process all kinds of data. So files, databases, streams. If you have a webhook, we'll take that. Basically, anything, any kind of data that needs to be ingested into the data lake or warehouse.
And Ashish is asking a question. He wants to clarify: is Etleap basically an easy way to handle ETL, and would you compare that to, say, for example, an Informatica or somebody in that space?
Yeah, we have we're a cloud native ETL solution. So we were built on AWS and for AWS, and so it's comprehensive, right? We're doing extraction from all kinds of sources, transforming it according to rules, as I showed you an example of earlier. There's also modeling and tight integration with the lake and warehouse services on AWS. So it's easy to get, it's sort of fast to get up and running. So something that typically differentiates us from other ETL providers is time to value, right? So the speed at which you can get up and running with your warehouse or lake, typically measured in end to end, it's days or weeks instead of months or years. So yes, we're an end-to-end ETL solution.
Fantastic. I think one of the other questions was, how do you deal with IP addresses, which we're finding a lot of countries are saying are considered PII because they can relate back to an individual? Do you also handle the ability to do IP addresses? And maybe this is a question for Ming too, is how do you handle IP addresses, or do you when it comes to PII?
Yeah, so from very early on, even before GDPR, we were already hashing all of our IP addresses. So we do maintain the uniqueness of them, but we always mask them. I think one of the benefits that I have is I don't deal with weblog data, which has a ton of IP addresses that you would have to then mask, and that's just more of a scale problem. But that's something that you do need to think about. If you are bringing in web data, any weblog data, IP addresses are native there. So our approach was to mask them. I think there's questions that you should be thinking about as to, could you keep maybe the first 2 octets or even 3 octets to keep some of the structure there so that you have some idea of the IP, but ultimately we just ended up hashing it.
Yeah, that's a good solution. This is one of the the unknown areas. I find when we talk to customers, they tend to think first name, last name, address, phone number, and all the kind of basic PII fields. But you start talking about IP addresses, then they're just, you have JFlow and NFlow data coming off of the switches and all sorts of things that need to be taken care of. A product asked a question, what are some of the other challenges in the ETL process apart from regulations that maybe Atleat helps deal with?
Sure, it's a good question. So there's complexity around getting started, as I said, getting something up and running where you have to, build the integration with a source, set up transformation rules, and design the warehouse schema, for example. That's traditionally a process that's taken a long time, and that's something where our approach and our software, it helps reduce that down to essentially a few clicks in the UI. When it comes to I'll mention two other points. One is monitoring and operations. Typically you need to have developers on standby to resolve issues, monitor the infrastructure, monitor the processes. It's very common that is something that ends up taking a good portion of a team's time. That's certainly the experience I had at my previous company. And then there's the infrastructure itself, maintaining and monitoring that. Oh yeah, sorry, I should say for monitoring and operations, that's completely handled by us, right? So if there's something that is something that's amiss, right? The connection goes down, or there's some kind of data issue that can't be handled automatically, then it's something our software will automatically notify you about. And then there's the infrastructure, right? When you're dealing with scalable infrastructure in particular, right? Having clusters for computing, big ETL jobs or streams. That's something that's often painful to operate, and you need sort of specialized skill sets for that. And again, that's something that Atleat handles out of the box. So yeah, those are three examples of other painful aspects of ETL.
All right, and I think let's just keep getting the questions coming. These are all been really fantastic, and I think this is also, in my opinion, most valuable aspect of these webinars is when you ask your questions and we can figure out what things you're interested in. Another question here about, so I think this is to Ming. There's different methodologies for truncating, hashing, encrypting. Do you use all of them? And if so, when do you decide which ones to use?
Yeah, so a lot of it depends on the specific use case. For things like address, we really said, what's the value of having somebody's personal address? If it wasn't a corporation, there was no reason for us to maintain personal addresses. So that data we just simply truncate down to a country or even a city level. That was just a blanket statement that we made. Things like phone numbers, you have to ask what is the use case. So if we're doing, how do support cases and support calls come in, and are there going to be multiple numbers that a person interacts with? There's a use case for actually hashing it, so maintaining the uniqueness. And email addresses, we pretty much standardize on, we do need to keep things like domain, so that we know how many people or identities from a particular domain are there, but we always hash it because we want to make sure that you have uniqueness of that email address, so how many email addresses has a particular contact engaged with you from. One thing that you have to keep in mind with things like email is any human input value, you have to normalize. So you've got to uppercase or lowercase it all the time, just so that your hashes stay consistent.
I think this might be a question for both of you, but if you have Salesforce.com, and you put data in, and you have a right to be forgotten request, and that person happens to be in your Salesforce.com. So maybe the user has been removed and deleted, but then the salesperson comes back and puts it back in. How do you stop that from happening again and again? Is there a way that you recommend as far as blacklisting or something that would either keep on running a process that would take it out, or what would you recommend for that kind of use case? Or do you have to deal with that?
I can go first. That's a really interesting scenario that we haven't thought about. I mean, normally when we deal with a right to be forgotten request, we deal with it at the time of. And if that data were to come back in for some reason, I would say that we'd probably approach it again and wait until the next right to be forgotten request, but we might need to look at how the regulation deals with that. Because if the person, say, volunteers themselves twice inadvertently, yes, we'll delete them anytime they ask, but we can't police them coming in, or perhaps we might need to. We'll have to think about that. But normally the action is to come out of the source.
On my side, I think that there's still quite a lot of questions coming out of case law in GDPR, right? So there may be requirements in the regulation that either can't be met, in which case we suspect that the case law will come back saying that it can't be met, or they'll make modifications based on not holding someone to the fire when it's too hard to deal with. But I think that's an interesting scenario, this idea that you might have to set up a blacklist of people who have been forgotten, and I think where Atleat can maybe come in on this is if you set up a pipeline, then maybe you create your blacklist, and then you have Atleat rerun transformations to remask anybody who's in that blacklist. That could be, in my mind, that might be the way to solve that problem.
Yeah, that sounds like that sounds like it might be a good approach. Sort of keeping the list or keeping that blacklist as sort of a separate entity, and then using that to blacklist data as it comes through. That's definitely a valid approach.
Interesting. I don't see any other questions on the panel. I'll give it another 30 seconds or so here. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to drop them in. And I'll say that I think this has been a really interesting breakout. Give you guys a little bit of feedback. We're going to have a couple of sessions at reInvent for anybody who's coming. You see the session IDs there. If they're full, feel free to jump in on the standing room. And then Atleat will be at reInvent booth number 1324. We look forward to following up with you guys there. I don't see any other questions, so we'll go ahead and close out. Thank you, Christian and Ming, for coming to present with us today. Thank you to all the attendees who took time out of your day to listen to the conversation here. And we appreciate your time. Have a wonderful week. Take care. Bye-bye.